The relay at Kalos 7 had been listening for 419 years when it finally found something worth waking me up for. I say waking me up loosely. I wasn't asleep. Nobody sleeps on a way station rotation, not in the way civilians mean the word. You cycle through 4-hour maintenance windows, eat 2 hot meals a day if you're disciplined, 3 if the shift is long and the ration stock holds, drink too much tea if you're not disciplined, which I'm not, and spend the remaining 18 to 20 hours doing exactly what the posting was designed for: listening. The way station's formal function is signals relay and sector traffic management. Its informal function, the one that doesn't appear in the recruiting material, the one you only understand after your first quiet month, is waiting. You are a human ear pressed against the edge of a very large silence. Most of what you hear is nothing. Static on the compression carriers, the low thermal hum of the relay trunks cycling through their handshake protocols every 40 minutes, the occasional navigational ping from a survey vessel transiting the outer buffer zone, which you log and file because that is what you do with navigational pings. Log them, file them, note that someone is out there. Most of the time, the nothing is what you are supposed to hear. It is not absence, it is quiescence. There is a difference, and you learn it in the first weeks, and after that you stop fighting it. I was content with the quiescence. I had been content with it for 11 months. Warrant Officer Sen Dravik, sole operator of way station Kalos 7, posted on a single rotation contract to the outer arm of the Oreth Passage buffer zone, monitoring 7 active beacon lanes, 4 dormant relay trunks, 1 compression hazard survey channel, and 2 navigational advisory frequencies that nobody used anymore but which the regulations required to remain monitored regardless. The duty log from my first month ran to 43 pages. By month 4 it ran to 9. By month 8, 4 pages, and some of those pages were half empty. There is an economy that comes with long solitude. You stop annotating the ordinary because there is nothing useful to say about the ordinary, and you save your words for the things that aren't. The quarterly sweep is the one departure from the pattern. You run it on the first day of each new station quarter, and it takes about 6 hours if you're careful, 8 if you're methodical, 12 if you find something. It's a full diagnostic pass across all trunks, active and dormant, checking carrier coherence, phase alignment, signal floor calibration, the kind of maintenance that keeps a relay station from slowly drifting out of accuracy without anyone noticing. I had run 3 quarterly sweeps since arriving at Kalos 7. The first one took me 11 hours because I was learning the station's particular quirks. The second and third took me 7 each. I had budgeted 7 for this one. The alert came in at 3:17 station time, which is the kind of hour that makes a person doubt their own reading comprehension. I was on trunk 4, the last of the dormant trunks, the one that ran out toward the deep buffer zone on a bearing that had been decommissioned from active relay traffic 30 years prior when the primary corridor shifted inward. Trunk 3 had thrown a minor phase error earlier in the sweep, which I had logged and flagged for the next resupply drops maintenance list. Trunks 1 and 2 had been clean. I was expecting trunk 4 to be clean as well and was already composing in the back of my mind the entry I would write: quarterly sweep complete, all trunks within nominal parameters. Trunk 3 phase error flagged for maintenance, no actionable signals traffic identified. The relay found the signal during the trunk 4 diagnostic, and the sweep did not finish in 7 hours. The signal was on a compression carrier. Old compression, the kind that predates the current encoding standard by 2 full protocol generations, the kind that the original way station operators would have needed specialized equipment to even detect, equipment that had not been standard issue at the time of Kalos 7 commissioning. The relay had been receiving the signal for as long as it had been operational, which was 419 years, because the signal had been arriving continuously for the entirety of that span. A carrier-locked loop repeating every 71 minutes with the mechanical patience of something that had never been told to stop. The relay's noise floor filters had classified it correctly by the standards of 4 centuries ago. Unrecognized header format, dormant band frequency, non-standard compression encoding, low priority background noise, file and move on. I had implemented a fleet signals bulletin 3 months prior. The bulletin was routine guidance, the kind that crosses every relay operator's desk twice a year. Updates to filter parameters for pre-diaspora signal recovery, issued because the Survey Corps had been running an archival sweep of old relay nodes and wanted current stations to flag anything the original filters might have missed. I had implemented it without particular expectation, the way you implement most routine guidance, because it is your job to implement it, and because you never quite know which update will matter. The updated filter set re-examined the trunk 4 noise floor during this sweep and reclassified the signal in the same pass that had flagged trunk 3's phase error. I sat looking at the classification for a while. The compression carrier was a distress format. Specifically, it was the emergency broadcast standard that Earth's Colonial Survey Corps had used during a window of approximately 40 years in the early settlement era, 3 centuries prior, before the current unified distress encoding had standardized the format across the sector. The signal's header now readable with the updated filters, for the first time since the signal had begun arriving, read as follows. TESSAVARS Reach, Colonial Charter Vessel, ORATH Passage Sector Designation KP7 Distress Active, requesting relay forward to Sector Command, all hands engine compression event, hull integrity compromised at sections 4 through 9, passengers aboard, 4,214, crew, 312, requesting immediate navigational assistance, compression gradient increasing. It repeated. It had been repeating at 71-minute intervals for 312 years. I got up from the console. I walked to the small galley at the far end of the operations module, poured a cup of tea from the pot I had brewed 2 hours earlier, and stood in the galley doorway drinking it and looking at the operations deck. The screens showed the sweep diagnostics, the trunk 4 alert pulsing in the upper left corner, the compression carrier's waveform displayed in the analysis window. I drank the tea. It had gone cold. I drank it anyway because doing something normal felt useful. Then I went back to the console and started working. The *Tessavars Reach was not a human ship. That was the first thing I confirmed, and it took me longer to confirm than it should have, because the name format was familiar enough to be disorienting. The Colonial Charter Designation System, the naming convention Earth Survey Corps had developed for colony vessels, had been sold, licensed, and in several cases simply copied by a dozen different species over the settlement era, for the practical reason that the human relay network covered more of the passage than any other network, and being legible to human relay operators improved your signal's chance of reaching someone. Non-human vessels using human format names and distress protocols was not unusual. It was, in fact, common enough that the Survey Corps had a whole section of their guidelines devoted to it. The vessel's registry number confirmed what the name format had already suggested. The *Tessavars Reach was a Voreth Compact Charter Colony Expedition, third wave settlement era, dispatched from the Compact's core systems to a resource-bearing outer system in the buffer zone. The passengers numbered 4,214. The crew, 312. The distress signal had been active since their hull was compromised in a stellar compression event in the Oreth Passage buffer zone, at a location that the signal's origin coordinates, degraded but recoverable, placed at a point that was, by current sector charts, approximately 14,000 kilometers below the current position of way station Kalos 7. The station had been built, 4 centuries ago, almost directly above where the *Tessavars Reach had been in distress. I checked the relay logs. Kalos 7 had not been operational when the signal originated. It had been under construction, the antenna array not yet calibrated, the primary relay trunks not yet cross-linked to sector command. The signal had arrived before anyone was listening. Then the station had come online, and the operators of that era had run their sweeps, and the signal had been present in the trunk 4 noise floor from day one, but their filter sets had not been able to classify it correctly. The compression format was already a generation old by then. The frequency was dormant band, the header was unrecognized, and it had been filed as background. Every operator who had served at Kalos 7 for 419 years had received that signal and not known what it was. 4,214 passengers, 312 crew, an engine compression event in the buffer zone, hull integrity compromised at sections 4 through 9. I had no way of knowing what had happened to them. The Vorath compact was in the sector database, but the sector database's entry for the compact was a summary document: current council seat, trade terms, capital system designation, a 2-paragraph overview of their political structure. It did not contain their colonial history from 3 centuries prior. It would not tell me whether the asterisk Tesavars Reach had survived, or whether 4,500 people had died in a stellar compression zone, while a relay station that hadn't yet opened sat 14,000 kilometers above them, logging the silence. That was the part I sat with for the longest time. The sweep had stopped mattering. The phase error on trunk 3 had stopped mattering. I was looking at the 71-minute cycle of a distress signal that had been playing into an empty room since before my grandparents were born, and I did not know whether the people who had sent it were alive. Protocol in this situation is clear, and I was glad to have it, because protocol gives you something to do when the doing is the only thing standing between you and the kind of thinking that doesn't help anyone. You log the intercept. You file the report with sector command. You send a courier drone to the originating party with an acknowledgement and a query. The acknowledgement is formal. We have received your distress signal. We are aware that the delay in response is extraordinary. We are filing this report and initiating contact. The query is practical. What is your current status? What is the status of the crew and passengers? Is there anything we can provide? I logged the intercept at 3:41. The intercept log entry was 14 lines, covering the signal's compression format, carrier frequency, header content, origin coordinates, estimated signal age, and the filter update that had enabled detection. I wrote the 14 lines carefully because they were going into the permanent record, and the permanent record is what remains when everything else is gone. I filed the report with sector command at 3:47. The report was longer, 31 pages, because sector command requires full documentation on dormant signal recovery, and I wrote every section with the care of a person who understood that someone at sector command was going to read this and either treat it as a routine archival notification or escalate it, and I wanted them to have every reason to escalate it. I had the courier drone loaded and prepped by 4:23. The drone carried the intercept log, the sector command report, and a separate message to the Vorath compact's nearest relay point, the acknowledgement and query I was required to send. I had written the query 4 times before I found a version I was satisfied with. The final version was formal in format and precise in content and contained, at its end, one sentence that was perhaps less formal than the rest. We do not yet know what happened to the Tesavars Reach colony, and we would be grateful to learn that everyone survived. If there is anything Way Station Kalos 7 can provide, please advise. I launched the drone at 4:31. Then I went back to waiting, which was the only remaining option and which, under the circumstances, was considerably harder than usual. The sweep never finished. I flagged it as interrupted by a priority intercept event and rescheduled the completion for the following day, which is what protocol allows. I logged trunk 3's phase error again in the new log entry so it wouldn't get lost. I made another cup of tea, A hot one this time, and drank it at the console watching the compression carrier repeat its 71-minute cycle, which it continued to do because I had not yet sent a formal acknowledgement on its receive frequency. I sent the acknowledgement that morning, once I had confirmed the relay link was stable and the acknowledgement would land on the correct band. The cycle stopped at the next interval. 312 years, and it had been waiting for someone to pick up. The courier drone reached the Vorath Compact's nearest relay point in 11 days and 4 hours, which was faster than the transit tables suggested, and which I attributed to a favorable compression current in the outer buffer zone. The Compact's relay forwarded my communication to their sector administration, which is their equivalent of our sector command, the regional authority covering the Compact's holdings in the passage. I received confirmation of delivery on day 14. I received the first response on day 22. The response did not come from sector administration. It came from an office I had not anticipated, the Imperial Archive of the Vorath Compact, Department of Historical Records, 2nd Sector Division, which is, as best I could determine from the Compact's public organizational structure, the equivalent of a national archive, the institution responsible for preserving and administering the Compact's long-term historical record. The officer who signed the response held the title of Senior Archivist, 2nd grade, which the Compact's organizational chart indicated was a senior position in their civil service. His name was Sothek Van. His message was 3 paragraphs, and I read each of them twice before I moved to the next. The first paragraph acknowledged my intercept report and my query with what I recognized, even through the translation filter, as the particular precision of a professional who has spent his career choosing words carefully. He thanked Waystation Kalos 7 for filing the notification and confirmed that my message had been reviewed by the appropriate authorities, who had forwarded it to the Imperial Archive on the basis that the *Tesavar's reach was a matter of historical record rather than current administrative concern. The second paragraph confirmed that the *Tesavar's reach was a registered colonial charter vessel of the Vorath Compact, 3rd wave settlement period, dispatched in what their calendar rendered as year 312 of the Compact expansion period, approximately 317 years prior by my reckoning. He confirmed that the *Tesavar's reach had encountered a stellar compression event in the Oreth Passage buffer zone, sustained hull damage, and sent a general distress signal. He confirmed that the colony had survived. The Tesavar settlement, now known as Veth Oreth, a mid-tier compact colony of some 200,000 residents on a habitable world in the outer buffer zone system, was fully operational. The crisis was 3 centuries past. The colony had thrived. He noted that this information would, he hoped, relieve the concern evident in my query, as he understood I might have been uncertain about the outcome. I read the second paragraph twice, and felt the tension in my shoulders ease in a way that told me I had been carrying it for 22 days without quite acknowledging it. The third paragraph was the one that kept me at the console for the next 3 hours. In the third paragraph, Sothek Van wrote, with the particular care of a man distinguishing between what a record shows and what people assume it shows, that while the survival of the *Tesavar's reach colony was documented in the Compact's historical record, the mechanism of that survival was not. The Compact's documentation of the crisis was incomplete. A series of administrative archive losses during a conflict in the period 240 to 270 years prior, a period the Compact's historians referred to as the Consolidation Wars, in the slightly euphemistic way that archives tend to name the periods that burned the most of them, had destroyed or scattered the original crisis documentation. The Compact knew the colony had survived. They did not know how. The gap was not a minor one. The *Tesavar's reach crisis, he noted, was a significant event in the Compact's settlement history, one of the defining moments of their third-wave expansion, cited in educational materials, memorialized at the colony site, included in the founding account that the original colonists had written, and that the colony of Veth Oreth maintained in its civic archive. The fact of the crisis and its survival were known. The mechanism of the survival was not. Theories had accumulated over 3 centuries of scholarly attention. A compact rescue fleet had arrived to assist, that much was established. But something had happened before the rescue fleet arrived, in the hours after the compression event, when the *Tesavar's Reach was in a deteriorating situation in an active compression zone, and the record of those hours was gone. He asked, with professional precision and what I thought I recognized as genuine curiosity, did Way Station Callow's 7 relay logs contain any traffic from that period? Because if the relay had been receiving the *Tesavar's Reach *S carrier signal for as long as I had indicated, it was possible. He noted this carefully, as a possibility rather than an assumption, that the relay had also logged other traffic on adjacent frequencies during the crisis window. Traffic that the archive losses had not reached. Traffic that had been sitting in the relay's log archive for 3 centuries, classified as noise, waiting for someone to ask the right question. I looked at Trunk 4. Relay systems log everything. That is their fundamental design principle and their defining purpose. They do not curate or classify or decide what is worth keeping. They log it all, and they keep it, and the storage is deep enough that 4 centuries of continuous logging does not fill it. What the noise floor filters had done was prevent that data from being forwarded to sector command or flagged for operator attention. They had not deleted it, because relay systems do not delete logs. The logs are the record is the point. I pulled Trunk 4's full archive, going back to the signal's origin window. What I found there took me most of a day to work through, and I want to be accurate about that time. The way each piece of it came clear, the way the picture assembled itself from fragments that had been sitting in the archive for 3 centuries, patient as everything the relay stored, waiting for the question. A compression carrier distress signal of the era the *Tesavar's Reach had used was not a one-way broadcast. The Colonial Survey Corps had designed that distress format specifically for the buffer zone environment, where the compression events that made the region a navigational hazard also made two-way communication unreliable over distance. The format transmitted distress information on its primary carrier, while simultaneously maintaining an open receiver on an adjacent frequency, listening for acknowledgement traffic. The design principle was, if you can't be sure your signal is reaching anyone, at least make it easy for anyone who does reach you to talk back. The *Tesavar's Reach had been sending their SOS and listening for a reply. The relay, logging everything, as relay systems do, had logged not only the SOS but the receive frequency as well. The reply traffic was in the Trunk 4 archive. It was fragmentary. Stellar compression events are brutal on signal coherence, and 3 centuries of archival storage had compressed the degradation further. There were gaps, phase inversions, sections where the compression had scrambled the data below recovery threshold. But the core of it was there, and once I understood what I was looking at, I stopped being a relay operator doing archival recovery work and started being, in the most unqualified sense of the word, a witness. Let me set out what the archive showed. The Oreth Passage buffer zone in the third wave settlement era was not empty. It had never been empty, but the specific presence in the buffer zone during the year of the *Tesavar's Reach crisis was one that the relay's existing documentation had not flagged, because it was not a presence that generated much traffic. A patrol network, operating under the Colonial Survey Corps Long-Range Observation Program, placing small scout-class vessels on extended circuits through the outer buffer zone to map stellar compression hazards and navigational anomalies. The mission was cartographic, not military. The vessels were small, 2-person crews, extended duration configurations, survey equipment rather than weapon systems. They were not designed for rescue operations. They were not equipped for rescue operations. They were in the buffer zone because someone had understood early in the settlement era that the passage's compression hazards needed to be mapped before they could be safely navigated, and mapping required presence. The Scout-class vessel that had been on circuit in the buffer zone during the *Tesavar's Reach crisis was designated Mervyn Ole in the Corps Registry. A two-person crew, navigation specialist and survey specialist, 18 months into a planned 24-month observation circuit. The Mervyn Ole's mission logs were not in the relay archive directly. What was in the archive was a data package that the vessel had synced to Trunk 4's outer node 4 months after the crisis, during a standard relay sync pass that all Corps vessels on extended circuits performed when they came within relay range. The sync was routine. The data package was what the Mervyn Ole had accumulated since the previous sync. It included the mission logs from the crisis period. I read them the way you read something you know matters before you know why, slowly, with the particular care of a person who understands that every word in front of them was written by someone who did not know anyone would ever read them. The Mervyn Ole's navigator. The log identified the crew by function rather than name, because the mission documentation at that era used registry numbers for personal identification, and the registry records were among the things the Compact's archive losses had not touched, but that the Corps' own long-ago archival reorganization had separated from the mission files. Had been running a compression gradient survey pass through the outer buffer zone when the *Tesavar's Reach SOS had appeared on her survey receiver. The survey receiver was scanning compression carrier frequencies because compression events themselves generated carrier frequency interference, and mapping that interference was part of her survey methodology. She had not been listening for a distress signal. She had been listening for the passage's own noise, and the *Tesavar's Reach had sent their SOS on exactly the right frequency to be heard by someone who was, for professional reasons, paying attention to that frequency at that moment. The log entry for that moment was brief. It read in the standard mission log notation of the era, 214 local, distress signal acquired, compression carrier format, colonial charter designation TESSAVAR's Reach, sector designation KP7, passenger colony vessel, hull compromise reported, compression event active. Signal origin approximately 340,000 km on bearing 227. Acknowledged on receive frequency. Beginning course correction to intercept. That was all it said. It did not explain the decision. It did not note any deliberation, any communication with a superior authority, any request for authorization. There was no record of the navigator or her companion discussing whether to go. The log recorded that she heard the signal, that she acknowledged it, and that she corrected her course. She had gone to them. The Mervyn Ole was not a rescue vessel. Her life support was configured for 2 people on a 24-month circuit, not 4,000 passengers in an emergency. Her medical kit was the standard 2-person survey Corps issue, adequate for 2, useless at scale. She had no heavy equipment for hull patching, no towing capacity, no emergency pressure systems. What she had, going into that course correction, was 18 months of compression gradient survey data covering the Oreth Passage buffer zone at a resolution that no other vessel in the sector could match, because she had spent those 18 months specifically mapping the compression topography of this region. She knew where the pressure ridges ran. She knew the stable corridors between the compression zones. She knew the buffer zone's hazard geography the way you know a piece of terrain you have spent a year and a half walking through, not from a chart, but from the accumulated observation of someone who had been paying attention. That data was what she brought to the *Tesavar's Reach *. She reached them in 31 hours. The log noted the intercept with the same economy it had noted everything else. 6:11 local, day 2. Tesavar's reach acquired visually. Hull breach visible at sections 4 through 7, compression induced. Vessel stationary in compression zone, gradient increasing. Initiating communication on colony charter distress band. The communication records were in the archive, degraded but recoverable in most sections. They were the most efficient communications I have ever read, because both parties were too busy to be anything but efficient. The Mervyn Olds navigator identified her vessel, her function, survey core, compression hazard mapping, and her capability with the precision of a person who wanted her counterpart to understand immediately what they were dealing with. She could not evacuate anyone. She could not patch the hull. She could not take on passengers. What she could do was navigate. The Tesavar's Reach's response was a sentence I read 3 times. Tesavar actual to the survey vessel. We did not call for you. Our SOS was routed to Compact Sector Command on the primary distress band. Who authorized your response? The navigator's reply came 4 minutes later, slotted between 2 compression gradient readings that she was still logging because the survey data mattered, and she was apparently capable of doing both things at once. Nobody, your signal hit my receiver. I was already in the zone with current gradient charts. I can take you out of the compression field if you follow my course corrections. That's what I have. Do you want it? There was a gap in the record at that point. Either the Tesavar's Reach took 7 minutes to respond, or the degradation has eaten that portion of the archive. When the record resumes, the Tesavar's Reach had said yes, and the navigation sequence had begun. 8 hours and 47 minutes. That was how long it took the Mervyn Olds to navigate the Tesavar's Reach from an active compression zone through the buffer zone's hazard field to stable space. The mission log recorded it in the same functional notation as everything else: course corrections, gradient readings, pressure ridge positions, hull status updates from the colony ship, the occasional clipped exchange when something in the zone shifted and the route needed real-time revision. I read all 8 hours and 47 minutes of it. There is a kind of attention that a long document rewards if you give it enough time, and this was that kind of document. What I found, working through the notation, was the shape of what it had actually been. The compression zone the Tesavar's Reach had entered was not a stable hazard. Stellar compression fields of that class shift. The pressure ridges move. The gradient intensifies and relents along axes that are not predictable from standard navigational charts, because the standard charts are built from survey data averaged across wide areas and do not capture the fine-grained topography that a survey specialist mapping hazards for 18 months would carry in her operational data. The Mervyn Olds navigator was making real-time decisions, not in the way that phrase implies a kind of heroic improvisation. She was doing the specific work she was trained to do, which was reading a compression field and identifying the safe passage through it. The same task she had been doing for 18 months, except that this time the stakes were 4,500 lives in a hull she could see through her viewport, running alongside her as she called the corrections. The log showed it in the data. Every 20 to 40 minutes, a new gradient reading. Every gradient reading followed by a course adjustment, sometimes minor 2 degrees. Hold bearing, sometimes significant 45 degrees starboard, reduce speed, pressure ridge building on your current heading. The Tesavar's Reach's hull reports appeared at irregular intervals, as the colony ship's engineers assessed the breach status and reported. Sections 4 and 5 pressure holding, Section 7 deteriorating, estimated 2 to 4 hours before structural failure at current compression exposure. The navigator's course adjustments tracked those reports. When the Section 7 deterioration was flagged, the log showed her pulling 3 hours of survey data on the nearest pressure ridge and revising the route, adding time to the transit, but reducing the compression exposure on the affected sections. She was managing the Tesavar's Reach's hull against the compression field the way you manage any system with a time constraint. Prioritize the failure point, reduce the load by the margin you need. There was one exchange in the middle of the transit that I read several times. The Tesavars Reach had a large number of passengers, and the passengers were aware of their situation in the way that 4,000 people in a hull breach are aware of it, which is to say, not uniformly and not quietly. The colony ship's bridge officer noted, at the 3-hour mark of the transit, that passenger management was consuming crew resources and asked whether the Mervyn Ole had any guidance to offer. The navigator's reply was brief: tell them we're on a route, tell them the route is mapped. They don't need to know anything else until we're out. The colony ship's bridge officer apparently relayed some version of this to the passenger sections, because the next crew report noted a reduction in the volume of interdeck communications traffic, which is the kind of detail that appears in a ship's log and tells you something true about what the interior of a vessel in crisis actually looks like. At hour 6, the log showed the navigator consulting her reserve survey data on the outer edge of the compression zone, the far boundary of the field, where the gradient eased and the stable space beyond began. The outer boundary was the most complex portion of the navigation. The pressure ridges at the field's edge are typically more irregular than those in the field's interior, because the edge is where the compression field interacts with uncompressed space, and the physics of that interaction creates turbulence that the field's interior does not have. She had mapped this section of the boundary 4 months prior, on a pass specifically designed to chart the exit corridors for vessels caught in the field's interior. She had mapped it because mapping it was her job. At hour 6, she used that map, and the Tesavars Reach followed the route it described, and 2 hours and 47 minutes later they were in stable space, and the compression field was behind them. The last navigation log entry at the moment of clearing the field read, Tesavars Reach in stable space, compression gradient nominal, structural integrity holding. Initiating long-range contact with Compact Sector Command, transmitting position and status. The entry after that, Compact Rescue Fleet inbound ETA 39 hours, standing by. The entry after that, 39 hours and some minutes later, Compact Rescue Fleet on station. Tesavars Reach transferred to Compact custody. Mervyn Ole resuming circuit. 3 entries, the shape of what it had been, compressed into the standard notation of a vessel that had done what it came to do and was returning to its scheduled work. I sat looking at those 3 entries for a while. Then I went back to building the record package. At the end of it, the Tesavars Reach was in stable space. The Mervyn Ole had used her long-range communications array, survey grade, intended for transmitting months of accumulated data back to Sector Command over the distances of an extended circuit, to summon the nearest Vorath Compact support vessel, transmitting the Tesavars Reach's position with full compression zone data and a status report on the colony ship's hull integrity. Then she had held position and waited. The Compact's rescue response arrived 39 hours later. The mission log noted their arrival with 4 words, Compact Rescue Fleet on station. The following entry, 1 hour after that, noted, Tesavars Reach transferred to Compact custody. Mervyn Ole resuming circuit. She had resumed her survey circuit. She had documented a compression zone transit assist as a navigation event, resumed her mapping work, and synced the data to the relay trunk at trunk 4 months later without, as far as the log showed, attaching any particular significance to the event beyond what the data showed. It was in the log because everything was in the log. She had made no separate report, filed no extraordinary documentation, given no indication that she considered what she had done to be anything other than the obvious response to a person who heard a signal and was in a position to answer it. I spent the rest of that day building the record package. I am a relay operator, not an archivist, and the package took longer to construct than it would have if I had been trained for this kind of work. But I understood what it needed to contain and why precision mattered, and I built it accordingly. The complete Trunk 4 archive from the crisis window, tagged by timestamp. The Mervyn Olds data sync, reconstructed from the degraded material, with the degraded sections clearly flagged and a technical notation on each explaining the source of the degradation and the confidence level of the recovered data. The navigation exchange, assembled in chronological order and set against the Tessevar's Reach's own hull status reports wherever the two could be matched. Because I understood, even without archival training, that a parallel record is more useful than a single record, and that Sothic Van would want to see both sequences running side by side so he could do the verification work his discipline required. A timeline cross-referencing the relay archive data against the historical record of the Tessevar's Reach crisis, as documented in the sector database's compact entry. A technical summary of the filter update that had enabled detection, the fleet signals bulletin, the updated parameter set, the exact mechanism by which the noise floor reclassification had worked. Because Sothic Van would want to know what had made this possible and why it had taken 4 centuries, and I wanted him to have a complete answer to that question rather than a partial one. In the technical summary, I noted, for the record, that the original Kalos 7 operators had done nothing wrong. Their filter sets had been appropriate to the equipment and standards of their era. The signal's format had been outside their detection capability, and classifying it as background noise had been the correct decision with the tools available to them. The failure, to the extent it was a failure, was not human error. It was the ordinary limitation of instruments not yet built to see what they were receiving. I noted this because accuracy matters most when it would be easier and perhaps more satisfying to assign blame, and because 4 centuries of relay operators who had done their jobs correctly deserved to have that said clearly in the record that would outlast all of them. I added a cover note. I wrote it 3 times before I found the version I wanted, which was precise where the facts required precision, and at the end, honest in the way that the situation seemed to call for honesty. The cover note said, in part, the relay's archive shows that the Tessevar's Reach distress signal was answered. The vessel that answered was an Earth Colonial Survey Corps Scout-class ship, 2-person crew, on a compression hazard mapping circuit in the buffer zone at the time of the crisis. The navigator used her compression zone survey data to guide the Tessevar's Reach through the hazard field to stable space, then used her communications array to summon your rescue fleet. The attached archive contains her mission logs and the navigation exchange in full. I am sending this because you asked whether the relay had logged any traffic from the crisis period, and it had. The relay was logging all of it, the whole time. Nobody told it to forward what it heard, and nobody thought to ask it what it knew. I am sorry it took this long for anyone to look. I launched the second courier drone on day 31 of the wait. Then I went back to the work of running the station. The quarterly sweep finished eventually. I completed the Trunk 3 phase error documentation and found nothing further in the dormant bands, nothing that the updated filters couldn't account for, nothing that needed more than a log entry and a maintenance flag. The duty log for the week of the intercept ran to 61 pages, which is the most I had written in a single week since my very first weeks at Kalos 7, and I recognized something in that fact, that the depth of the log tracks the weight of what happened, and that this was appropriate. A 61-page week should look different from a 4-page week. The record should reflect the difference. The 37 days between launching the drone and receiving Sothic Van's second message were some of the odder waiting I had done on this posting. I knew more than I had known before, and I had no one to tell, and the station had not changed in any of the ways that might have made it feel like the place where something significant had occurred. The trunks cycled their handshake protocols. The compression hazard survey channel was quiet. Trunk 3's phase error persisted at the same level, neither better nor worse. The 7 active beacon lanes logged their ordinary traffic, survey vessels, navigational pings, the occasional resupply manifest filing from a freighter running the outer corridor. I logged all of it. I ran my maintenance windows. I drank too much tea. I thought, more than was professionally necessary, about 8 hours and 47 minutes in a stellar compression zone, and about the founding account at Veth Orath, and about a line that had sat in a civic archive for 3 centuries waiting for the record to catch up to it. Sothick Van's second message arrived on day 68. It was 17 pages, formatted in the Compact's archival notation standard, which I ran through the translation filter twice, once for vocabulary and once for register, because archival notation has a formal precision that the standard filter tends to flatten into bureaucratic phrasing, and I wanted to understand what he was actually saying, not just what the filter thought he was saying. The first 14 pages were the work of a scholar doing what scholars do when they receive a primary source document that changes the shape of what they know. He verified everything. He cross-referenced the Mervyn Olds navigation log against the Compact's surviving records of the Tesavar's Reach crisis, matching course corrections against the compression gradients recorded in the colony ship's own hull stress logs, which had survived the archive losses because they were engineering records rather than administrative records and had been stored in a different system. He validated the timing against the Compact Rescue Fleet's arrival report, which had survived in fragmentary form and now, with the Mervyn Olds log as a reference point, could be fully interpreted. He confirmed the Relay Archive's authenticity through 6 independent cross-references that I will not list in full because the list runs to 3 pages in his notation, and the conclusion is the point. The record was authentic. The record was complete. He confirmed, in the language of his discipline, that the Mervyn Olds navigation guidance had been the mechanism by which the Tesavar's Reach had passed through the compression zone. He confirmed that this was the missing piece, the event that the Compact's historians had known had occurred, because the colony had survived when survival without external assistance was not plausible, but had never been able to document. He noted that the recovered material would be entered into the Imperial Archive as a primary source, with full provenance documentation, and that copies would be transmitted to the Veth Orath Colony Archive, the Colonial Survey Corps for their own historical record, and the Passage Advisory Council's joint archives, which maintained records of interspecies assistance events in the buffer zone. The 15th page changed register, the way pages sometimes do when a writer has finished the formal portion and has something else to say. Sothick Van wrote that there was a line in the Tesavar's Reach crisis, record that the Compact's historians had carried for 300 years without being able to interpret. The line appeared in the colony's founding account, the narrative document that Veth Orath kept in its civic archive, the origin story in the original colonists' own words. The founding account had survived the consolidation wars because it had been copied by hand at the colony site, generation after generation, each copy made before the previous one deteriorated, kept not as an administrative document, but as the colony's definition of itself. 4 copies of it still existed, spanning 3 centuries, each one a handwritten reproduction of the one before. In all 4 copies, in the section describing the compression event and the survival that followed, the same line appeared, and out of the dark of the compression zone came a small vessel with a steady light, and it guided us through what we could not navigate alone, and we do not know its name, but we know its bearing, and because of that bearing we are here. The original colonists had known someone came for them. They had seen the vessel small, lights visible through the viewport of a ship with a compromised hull in a stellar compression zone, running close alongside them for the navigation pass, visible against the compression field's own luminescence. They had not known the name, the species, the mission, the origin, the reason. They had written what they could see and what they knew was the bearing, the course corrections that the Mervyn Olds had given them, the route through the pressure ridges that they had followed, because it was the only route available, and because a voice on the communications band had told them to follow it, and they had had no reason to distrust a voice that was already alongside them in the compression zone. The founding accounts historians had theorized, over 3 centuries, that the small vessel was a compact scout that had arrived ahead of the official rescue response, and whose records had been lost in the same archive event that had taken the rest of the crisis documentation. No one had considered that it might not be a compact vessel at all. No one had known to ask whether a human survey ship had been mapping compression gradients in the buffer zone at the relevant time, because the human relay network's presence in the outer buffer zone at that era was not well documented in the compact's own records. The question had not been askable. Now it was. He ended page 15. The small vessel with the steady light was yours. Your survey corps sent it into the buffer zone to map the hazards, and when it found a ship in distress in those hazards, it used those maps to bring the ship out. The colonists who wrote the founding account did not know the name of what had helped them. Now we do. And the reason we know is that your relay station was logging and listening when no one thought it was doing anything that mattered. The 16th page was the formal request for the Trunk 4 archive transfer, submitted through the appropriate interspecies channels, citing the Passage Advisory Council's regulations for archival exchange between member species and requesting Earth Sector Command authorize the transfer. The 17th page was shorter than the others. Sothick Van wrote, I have been in this archive for 30 years. The work of an archivist is mostly confirmation. The record says what it says. You document that it says it, and the knowledge settles into certainty. Occasionally, rarely, you find the thing that changes the shape of what you know. Not often. Rarely enough that, when it happens, you remember where you were when you understood what you had found. I was at my desk reading the relay operator's cover note, and I understood from the cover note before I had opened any of the attached files, and I sat with that understanding for a time before I could do the work of verifying it. I am grateful to your station. I am grateful to your relay logs and your filter update and your quarterly sweep. And I am grateful, in a way that I recognize is inadequate across the distance and the 3 centuries between us, to the crew of the Mervyn Ole, who heard a signal that was not sent to them and went. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, what the Tessavar colony has been trying to name for 300 years. I sent the formal endorsement to Sector Command the following morning, recommending authorization of the archival transfer and noting my assessment that the event fell under the Waypoint Accord's mutual aid provision. I did not know, when I wrote the endorsement, that Sector Command would agree about the Accords. I thought I was recommending an archival exchange. I was apparently also recommending something else. Sector Command replied in 9 days. 9 days is, for Sector Command, nearly instantaneous. They operate on a 30 to 60-day standard response cycle for non-urgent communications, and 9 days told me something before I had even opened the reply. They authorized the archival transfer. They noted that the Mervyn Ole incident would be entered into the Colonial Survey Corps historical record as a documented navigation assist event, with the recovered mission logs as primary source, and they flagged the event under Section 12 of the Waypoint Accords. Section 12 governs mutual aid events in the passage buffer zone. Its provision is that documented assistance events between Earth and treaty-adjacent species, navigational, medical, or emergency assistance, regardless of whether a formal request was received or the assistance was pre-authorized, constitute the basis for a standing bilateral contact. Not a treaty, not an alliance. A contact, formal acknowledgement that an assistance event occurred, documentation of it, notification to both parties, and the offer of a standing channel for future communication under the Accord's framework. The Mervyn Ole had provided navigational assistance to the Tessavar's reach in the Oreth Passage buffer zone. The event was documented. Both parties had acknowledged it. Earth was sending a diplomatic envoy to the Voreth Compact, not to resolve a crisis, because there was no crisis to resolve, only a 3-century-old one that had resolved itself, but because that is what the Accords require when you find, in a relay archive, evidence that help was given and received across the silence of the passage. You acknowledge it, you make sure the record is complete. I sent Sothick Van a brief message telling him what was coming. I kept it short because the situation was already carrying its own weight. At the end I added, the Mervyn Olds captain is identified in the archive only by rank and registry number. I filed a request with the Colonial Survey Corps to see if the full personnel record can be recovered from their files. The founding account at Veth Orath deserves a name to put with the bearing. The Survey Corps replied to that request 6 weeks later. The Mervyn Olds crew had been listed in the Corps personnel records under their full registry designations. The Corps' own records had not been subject to the same archive losses as the compacts, because the two institutions had not shared the same conflicts. The records existed. The names were there. I forwarded them to Sothick Van without commentary. They were his to give to Veth Orath, not mine to announce. He replied within the hour, the fastest message he had ever sent me, which told me everything about what those names meant. He wrote only, "Thank you. Now they can name it properly." The diplomatic envoy reached the Vorath Compact 44 days after Sector Command dispatched it. The formal acknowledgement under Section 12 of the Waypoint Accords was signed 11 days after that. The archival transfer of Trunk 4's complete log was completed in the weeks following. The duty log for that quarter was the longest I had ever written, and I wrote every page of it with the care the record deserved. I finished my 11-month rotation 2 weeks after the Accords. Notification was confirmed. I handed Callows 7 over to my replacement, Warrant Officer Talov, first solo rotation, who asked precise questions about all 4 trunks and took notes in a way that told me the station would be well tended, and shipped back to Sector Command for debrief. The reviewing officer asked what I had done differently to catch the signal. I told her I had implemented the Fleet Signals Bulletin on pre-diaspora carrier recovery. She noted that in the record. She asked if I had any other observations for the incident file. I told her what I believed, which is not always what a debrief wants to hear, but which in this case happened to be both true and useful. Update the filters and keep them updated. Run the sweep with methodical care, not with the efficiency that comes from knowing in advance that nothing will be there, because that assumption is self-fulfilling, and self-fulfilling assumptions in relay work are how signals sit in noise floors for 4 centuries. Don't assume the noise floor's classification is the signal's nature. The noise floor is a filter. Filters are tools. Tools are only as good as the parameters they're given. The relay is not deciding what matters, it is logging everything, because that is what relay systems do, because the people who designed them understood that you cannot know in advance what will matter. The deciding is yours. You set the parameters, you run the sweep, and you look at what the filter flags before you move on. She asked if I had anything else. I told her to note in the incident record that 419 years of relay log data had been preserved intact, and that this preservation had been directly responsible for the historical recovery. The log was the record. The record was why any of it was possible. Relay operators should understand that the logs they keep may matter to someone they will never meet, in a way they cannot anticipate, across a span of time that makes anticipation meaningless. Keep the logs complete. Keep them intact. The relay will be there long after the operator, and what was logged will still be in it. She noted that in the record too. On leave, I looked up Veth Orath in the sector database. 200,000 residents, mid-tier colony, established 312 years prior by the Tesavars Reach expedition. Under the colony's public entry in the notes field, someone had added a new line. Recently, the timestamp was fresh. Founding navigation assisted by Colonial Survey Corps vessel Mervyn Ol, Orath Passage Buffer Zone, Third Wave Settlement Era. Documented under Waypoint Accord Section 12, bilateral contact registered current date. Primary source record held at the Imperial Archive of the Voreth Compact and the Colonial Survey Corps Historical Division, with relay archive copies maintained at Waystation Kalos 7. Below that, a second new line, even more recent. The primary landing field at the Tessavar colony's original settlement site has been redesignated Mervyn Point by action of the Veth Oreth Colony Council. The name was formally registered in the Compact Planetary Registry on the date of this notation. I sat in a transit lounge reading that, with a cup of tea that the station machine had gotten right for once, while the ships came and went through the departure windows the way they do at any busy junction in the passage, steady, unhurried, the ordinary traffic of people moving through a sector that has been here for a long time and intends to be here for longer. Somewhere out in the buffer zone, the relay at Kalos 7 was listening. It was logging the quiet and the small signals and the phase fluctuations on Trunk 3 that Taylov would be tracking. It was doing what it had always done, what it had been built to do, what it had been doing for 4 centuries before anyone asked the right question. The signal that had been waiting 312 years for an answer was gone now, because it had won. The loop had closed. The SOS that had played into an empty room since before my grandparents' grandparents were born had finally been forwarded to Sector Command, which was the last step it had been waiting for, which was what a relay station does. It forwards the signal. But the relay was still listening, because that is what relay stations do after they forward the signal. They keep listening. The next thing is always out there in the compression bands, on the dormant trunk frequencies, in the noise floor that is not always noise. You update the filters. You run the sweep. You stay at the console and you pay attention, and you do not decide in advance what counts as background. That is the job. That is all the job has ever been. You keep the ear open. The signal finds you. Then you answer it.